You're listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We believe the Bible doesn't need to be watered down or cleaned up to be understood. Our goal is to provide a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. I'm your host, Colin Connor. Now, on to the episode. Hey everyone, before we get into the episode, I just want to give you a quick reminder that we have coming up our 50th episode, our 1-year anniversary episode in just a few weeks here. It's going to be really fun. We're going to talk about some of the stuff that has happened in the past year, give you some exciting sneak peeks into what we have coming in the year ahead, and we want to take a little bit of time just to be able to hear from you as well. So if you have enjoyed the podcast, found something that we've said helpful, or just want to share with us how you have experienced being a part of this Bible study with us over the last year, we want to hear from you. You can send us an email, you can write in on our website, you can comment on the socials, you can also send in an audio recording if you'd like. You can email it to cconn@thebibleuncut.com and give us your thoughts on how the podcast has been on this last year. We will try to include some of them in the episode along with everything else that we are doing. But this week is the deadline for that. So if you want to be a part of that, be sure to send it in this week. Okay, now we are going to be covering Ecclesiastes chapter 10. And boy, oh boy, is this quite the chapter. We are going to be nerding out majorly here. There is going to be some Hebrew that you are going to learn, or actually, it's Hebrew that you already know, and you just don't realize you know it. That's one of my favorite parts of teaching Bible, is when I get to show people that they already know Hebrew and Greek words that they had no clue they knew. It's so cool. Man, we are going to be talking about snake charming. We're going to be talking about Greek gods. We're going to be talking about getting wisdom from birds. There is a bunch of crazy stuff in this chapter. So, without any further ado, let's get right into Ecclesiastes chapter 10, Uncut and Unfiltered. As with the last chapter or so, this part of Ecclesiastes is very similar to Proverbs. It's a lot of loosely associated proverbial sayings, little pithy quotes, and maybe a little bit of commentary on each one, but it's just kind of a hodgepodge of a lot of different topics. And different commentators will try to tell you, oh, they're connected this way, or here's this overarching theme, but there's no real agreement to how any of these verses tie together. I do think there are just some general themes that Qoheleth follows, but as he's coming to the end of his lecture here, he is sharing with us just kind of the odds and ends of wisdom that he has accumulated along this journey. So we're going to read the first 4 verses together right now. They're kind of loosely associated, and honestly this whole chapter is loosely associated on the main themes of foolishness versus wisdom and political upheaval. Those are kind of the 2 main themes, and then we also get into risk and reward in the middle. But right now, let's just look at the first 4 verses and see what we can learn. Verse 1, dead flies cause the ointment of the apothecary to send forth a stinking savor. So does a little folly him that is in reputation for wisdom and honor. A wise man's heart is at his right hand, but a fool's heart is at his left. Now, no, that is not anatomically correct. That's not trying to make any medical statement there saying that we are all fools. So don't worry. We will get into what that means in just a minute here. Verse 3, indeed also, when he who is a fool walks by the way, his wisdom fails him, and he says to everyone that he is a fool. If the spirit of the ruler rise up against you, don't leave your place, because yielding pacifies great offenses. Alright, so verse 1. This, I would say, is one of the more popular verses in Ecclesiastes. Again, any verse in Ecclesiastes isn't going to be super popular, but as far as Ecclesiastes verses go, this is definitely one that I had heard outside of just reading the Bible. Granted, I grew up in a very conservative fundamentalist church, so most of what I read growing up had a little bit of a religious flair to it as well, so it was probably just in some of those books, but this is a verse that was commonly used to say, basically, don't ever screw up, because the smallest wrong thing that you do will just wipe out every good thing that you've ever done. Not entirely sure that is what the verse means, though, and even if it is, we have to question the validity of that statement, which we're going to do in a minute. First, I just want to give you a literal translation of this verse. because it doesn't read exactly how a lot of English versions put it. Literally, this would read, "Flies of death make mixed oils gush forth stench. A little foolishness makes wisdom and honor scarce." Let's talk about the first bit of that for a second here. Flies of death, or dead flies, cause the ointment of the apothecary, or literally just mixed oils. The idea is basically perfumes, ointments, maybe even some form of ancient medicine. If you had a dead insect fall in there, it could potentially spoil the remedy, the oil. Now, I will readily admit, I am not an apothecary. I do not have any experience in mixing together oils and perfumes and remedies of any sort. But just reading this as a layperson in that instance, I kind of question a little bit how much one dead fly could actually cause an entire bottle of oil to stink. That just doesn't seem realistic to me. And interestingly enough, in the rabbinic commentary Qoheleth Rabbah on this chapter, one rabbi argued that a single fly isn't enough to ruin a bottle of perfume. Now, he did still go on to say that a single sin can cause someone to lose much good, but I'm kind of questioning Qoheleth's analogy here. I'm also wondering if there's just some aspect of ancient perfume making that I'm not familiar with that could help to make sense of this. Whenever there's some verse in the Bible that just doesn't seem to make sense, it's usually because it made sense back then, but culture has changed so much over the years, not to mention we're half a world away, that sometimes it just gets lost in the translation. So I don't know if this is a particular kind of fly that had a really potent smell if it died, or if it's a really small bottle of perfume. I'm not sure. But now that we have overanalyzed his analogy, I do want to point out the Hebrew word for flies, because this is an example of whether or not you realize this, you already likely know the Hebrew word for fly. It's zebub. Zebub is how you would transliterate it over into English. Sebub. Now, does that sound familiar at all to you? What if I put a Canaanite deity name right before it? Baal Zebub. Still nothing? How about if I anglicize it? Beelzebub. How about that? The Canaanite god that shows up a lot throughout the Tanakh, Baal, or as many English speakers say, Baal, is combined with another name, Zebul, to form Baal Zebul in certain situations. But then it seems like the Hebrews, the ancient Israelites, took that name and basically made a pun off of it to make fun of the god. So instead of Baal Zebul, you ended up with Baal Zebub, which became Lord of the Flies. Baal or Baal means Lord or Master. So in fact, there's even some instances in the Tanakh in the Old Testament where Yahweh is referred to as Baal in the sense of Lord or Master. It's really interesting. That's a whole other rabbit trail for a different day. But yeah, that's how we actually got Beelzebub, is because you had Baal Zebul, which then was made fun of as Baal Zebub. They changed the word Zebul to Zebub for fly, so it became Lord of the Flies, not the book. And then over the years, it became anglicized as Beelzebub and became a reference to the devil, which is quite a story of how that all got there, but just an interesting tidbit for you. Now, I want to consider what this particular verse is actually saying, because the moral that people get out of this is one little thing that you do wrong just wipes out any good that you've done. At least that's how it was taught to me growing up. It was basically a fear tactic to try to keep you from ever sinning. And I just want to point out, fear is not a great motivator. It can be in the moment, but if you're constantly trying to motivate people to do right by fear, which is honestly what a lot of preachers do, eventually that's just going to stop working because people can't constantly live in fear. And a lot of times it's actually just going to create kind of a reverse curiosity where now they're interested in that, or perhaps where they're just so afraid of failing or messing up that they figure, well, I'm going to anyway, so I might as well just give it all up. So that was not the best way to teach this passage. But is that what Qoheleth is actually saying? One little wrongdoing can uproot a whole bunch of good in your life. I think that is the general idea of what he's trying to say. Basically, one bad apple spoils the whole bushel. But is that a fair assessment of people? Let's say you have someone who lives, let's just say 60 to 80 years, they're a mixed bag of good and bad in that time. No matter who the person is, there will be some good things that they have done. And no matter who they are, there will be some bad things that they have done. And it will probably lean one way or the other. But is there any one bad thing a person does that completely eliminates all of the good that they have done before? Or vice versa? Is there any good thing that a person can do that removes all of the bad that they have done before? I'm not necessarily looking to answer that once and for all here as much as just get you thinking along these lines. I think in Qoheleth's day, with this very Eastern honor shame culture that they would have had, it may have played in more so than it does in our individualized Western culture today. Because in an honor shame culture, what the community thinks of you is everything. So somebody who does something that brings some shame upon the community is going to then be looked down upon in that community because they haven't just affected themselves, they have affected the whole community. Whereas today, if somebody in a church does something stupid, yeah, the church might be upset about it, but it's not like the entire church now has a bad reputation. I think sometimes people talk like that or think that's the way it works, but that's not really how it works in America. If you have somebody in your company that, I don't know, gets fired for embezzlement, that mostly just looks bad on them. It doesn't look that bad on the company. The company actually ends up looking like a victim rather than part of the problem. But even then, there are some ways that our culture today still kind of reflects these same honor shame values that the ancient Near East did. And honestly, even still, the modern Near East and modern Far East can as well. And I see that a lot in modern cancel culture, where you kind of just have this idea of we find out about some bad thing that this person did, usually in the past, and now we cancel them. We say anything that you do or say from this point on, and even back then, is no longer good. Everything is read in light of this one mistake. And I realize this is a very broad category. That can be anything from somebody being a teenager and saying something stupid on Facebook to full on sexual assault or abuse. So obviously there's a big spectrum in there, and I'm not saying that we should excuse all of it and just be okay with anything in the past. No, obviously some situations require bigger retribution than others. But I do think that we need to be careful about the idea of canceling. I'm not against somebody having to take responsibility for something that they've done in the past, especially if they got away with it in the past. Especially here in America, we've very much had a good old boys culture where you can say and do things that are not great and you could get away with it. So, especially if it was something where they were never held accountable before, I get it. It's okay to make people take accountability for what they've done. But even somebody who has done horrible things, that doesn't mean that everything they've ever done before or ever will do again is completely worthless. And none of us actually act this way. We might say that about a particular celebrity for a while, but then after a while it's forgotten about and we go back to listening to their music or watching their movies or what have you. And honestly, we only do that with celebrities and sometimes minor celebrities too, but we only do it with public personalities. We don't do that with corporations when they take advantage of people or misuse the environment or use child labor or any of these things. Like, sure, we might try to boycott for a little while, but even then that is given up as well. So there's no real consistency. We just pick cancel culture whenever it's somebody that doesn't actually affect us that much, because the second it would actually start to affect us, well, of course I'm going to go see that movie, of course I'm going to listen to that music, of course I'm still going to shop at Walmart, of course I'm still going to buy that product. We try to sound holy as if we aren't also guilty of things in our past that we're ashamed of. We need to make people accountable for what they've done, but we also need to allow for the good that they have done as well. It's definitely a complex issue, but just because someone has done something wrong, no matter how bad it is, doesn't mean that every single thing they've ever done no longer has value. And I don't even think that's what Qoheleth is trying to say. I think we kind of assume that, but he never actually says it here. He's just saying that foolishness causes even a wise and honorable person to have a little bit of a stench of suspicion around them. That's not the same thing as saying that everything that the person has ever done is bad. And, it's so inconsistent, especially among Christians, because the same Christians who sometimes want to say, oh, that person did that one bad thing, I'll no longer listen to their music, or I'll no longer watch their movies, or, buy their brand, or what. Those are the same people who read and sing the Psalms that were mainly written by a murderer and adulterer. So if they were truly consistent in their cancel culture, they wouldn't read the majority of the Psalms that were written by David. But, we don't like to be consistent. I think it's also worth noting that nothing in this verse says that this is the way life should be. We have to realize the difference between a prescriptive passage and a descriptive passage. A lot of Christians open the Bible and just think that whatever it says is automatically prescriptive. That's dangerous because the majority of the Bible is actually just descriptive, describing what people there and then did, not necessarily prescribing what we here and now are supposed to do. And if you just open the Bible and think it's automatically prescriptive, you're going to start acting really bad really fast if you're trying to follow the example of a lot of the main characters, because they were very messed up people most of the time. So this is not necessarily saying, oh, this is the way it should be. We should automatically cancel somebody as soon as they do one bad thing. We should automatically judge them by the wrong that they do. Qoheleth is offering just wisdom, practical advice on life, and he's speaking to people who probably have a promising career ahead of them, and he's saying, be careful. I'm not saying this is the way it should be, I'm just saying this is the way it is. No matter how much good you do, you screw up a little bit, and people are going to remember you for that rather than the good that you did. And even then, that's still going to be dependent on the values of the community. In a lot of churches today, if a young person goes out and has sex before marriage, that's going to be seen as this awful thing that ruins their reputation forever. But the pastor might be able to get away with sexual abuse and still just have it written off as a misstep because he's the man of God. So really, this maxim only works if you're not the one holding power, because usually the people who hold power are able to get away with more. And yes, that's a little cynical, but that's kind of the way Qoheleth has been through a good bit of this. Maybe not cynical as much as just realistic. We have to realize that that is the way of the world. We don't have to agree with it. We don't have to say that's the way it should be, but we should be aware of it. We don't have to act this way as well to fit in with the way of the world, but we should realize that this is the way other people are going to behave. So we should expect it to go this way. And note, too, that Qoheleth doesn't actually say, don't ever make a mistake. Like, we're all going to make mistakes. We're all going to do stupid things. We're all going to have things at the end of our life that we are not proud of. But I think what he's trying to say more so is just be careful when you do make mistakes. Try to make your mistakes in private rather than in public. Or, as we used to say in college, if you're going to be stupid, be smart about it. Now, moving into verse 2, where he says, a wise man's heart is at his right hand, but a fool's is at his left. This is yet another opportunity for you to learn a little bit of Hebrew that you already knew and didn't know you knew. The word for right hand there is yamim. And you say, I don't know that word, Colin. Well, you kind of do. You know it in a name. What if I add the word Ben onto the front of it? Ben Yamin. Now what if I anglicize it? Benjamin. We get our English name Benjamin from the Hebrew Ben Yamim, which literally means son of my right hand. That's when you have Jacob and his 12 sons and Joseph with Benjamin, and Benjamin's the youngest of the 12, so he's the son of my right hand, Ben Yamin there. So a little bit of Hebrew there that you didn't realize that you already knew. So you have 2 Hebrew words under your belt already today, Zebub and Yamim. Interestingly enough, the word for left hand, simul, can also mean north, because you notice here that we have a positive association with right and a negative association with left. Well, this same word for left, which can also mean north, that's the direction that judgment usually comes from in the Tanakh. See, directions, the 4 points of the zodiac or the 4 points of the compass, are really important when you're reading the Bible. They have meanings that are just coded in there, where usually if somebody travels east, that's almost always a bad thing. If someone is coming from the north, they're probably going to enact violence. If they're moving south, they are going into a place of safety. If they're moving west, they're going back home. So we have these different cardinal points that have kind of a baked in meaning that people back then would have understood that we don't necessarily understand today because our mindset is different than theirs. We need to be careful not to make too much out of this right hand versus left hand thing. It's just because the majority of people in the world are right-handed that became associated with a symbol of strength, whereas the left hand became a symbol of weakness. There are things I can do with my right hand that I just can't with my left. Like, I am not at all ambidextrous. I cannot write with my left hand. I can definitely tell that I'm stronger with my right than I am with my left. So it just became the idea of, well, if we're going to have an image for good and evil, or good and bad, or strong or weak, well, right and left hand. It makes sense, but we shouldn't make too much of that. Brown in the interpretation commentary says the heart of the wise and that of the fool are oriented in diametrically opposing ways, both cognitively and morally. They literally face in opposite directions. The Net Bible notes go on to say the phrase right hand is a Hebrew idiom for the place of protection. In ancient warfare, the shield of the warrior was on one's right hand side to protect their right hand. Qoheleth's point is that wisdom provides protection. End quote. That's an interesting take on it. The 1985 JPS translation footnotes explained it as a wise man's mind brings him good luck, a fool's brings him bad luck. Also an interesting take. But again, I would not try to read anything more into this than that. So why do you keep focusing on that? Well, because there are people out there who want to take this and read politics into it. And as you can imagine, they are going to be of a conservative bent, because they are going to say that a wise man's heart is at his right hand, thus conservative politics, versus a fool at his left, i.e. liberal politics. And that gives me a headache. That is not good Bible interpretation. This is a perfect illustration of how people just read what they want to into a text, and we can't just take a surface reading and say, well, this is what the Bible says. No, our culture is not the same as theirs, and so something that means one thing in our culture might mean something totally different in theirs. And I'm sure that several people who have made that joke in the past just meant it as a joke, but I'm also pretty confident that some people really thought that's what God was trying to say here, is that conservative politics are wise and progressive politics are foolish. But the concept of conservative politics being on the right and progressive on the left is actually only as recent as the French Revolution. So we're talking a millennium and a half plus after the time of Jesus, which would then be about 2,000 years since the time that Ecclesiastes was written. So it has nothing to do with that. During the time of the French Revolution, those in favor of revolution grouped away from the king's supporters by moving to the left side of the National Assembly building in 1789. Now, ironically, that group was actually called the Republicans, so the original Republicans were on the left. But then those in favor of maintaining the monarchy then moved to the right side of the hall in response to what the French Republicans had done. And this practice then carried over into today, as American politicians in favor of reform, which would be the Democrats, usually sit on the left of the House and Senate, while those in favor of upholding the status quo, which would be Republicans, tend to sit on the right. So that whole right-left political terminology is not even 250 years old in human history, and it has absolutely no moral connotation whatsoever. Amusingly, though, there is actually a lot of political discourse in this chapter, and it has been read through a political lens, even going back to ancient Jewish commentators. We've mentioned Rashi before, one of the most famous Jewish commentators of ancient times. He compared Nebuchadnezzar to the pit digger that we're going to find in verse 8, and claimed that the king's children died because he removed the gold and silver from the temple. He also read verse 7 through the lens of Israeli princes being forced into exile. And then a little later in the chapter, we're going to come across some reference to snake charming. And Psalm 58:5 compares the duplicitous words of evil rulers to snake charmers. So there are some interesting political connotations throughout this chapter, or maybe I should just say ways that you can read the chapter politically, but within ancient politics, not modern ones. Moving into verse 3, when a fool walks by the way, his wisdom fails, and he says to everyone that he is a fool. Murphy, in the Word Biblical Commentary, favors reading this as a literal road that a literal foolish man is walking on, rather than a metaphor for walking through life. He goes on to say, it can mean that the fool tells everyone that he is a fool. Or the verse can mean that he calls everyone else a fool. The former is more likely, and then one can understand this to mean that he advertises his foolishness by his foolish conduct. The New Century Version translates as, even in the way fools walk along the road, they show they are not wise. They show everyone how stupid they are. The New Living Translation says, you can identify fools just by the way they walk down the street. Now, I don't like that translation because I don't think that's accurate. I think it takes away what Qoheleth is saying because you can't always tell a foolish person just by seeing them in public. Sometimes a person can seem really smart and put together, and then you have to hear them talk or see what they do before you realize just how foolish they actually are. The Message Bible brought a thought-provoking translation that I wanted to share. It said, fools on the road have no sense of direction. The way they walk tells the story. There goes the fool again. Now, I realize that Peterson gets a lot of flack for that particular translation, but he actually had a pretty decent understanding of the languages and really gets at the heart of a lot of verses in good modern English. So, the Message Bible actually doesn't deserve as much flack as it gets. His translation of that verse really got me thinking a little bit. Now, going just back to the King James, it says, his wisdom fails him. But that's not actually how the text reads. Literally, the verse would read, also, when the fool walks on the path, his heart lessens, and he tells everyone he is a fool. So a lot of translations will say something along the lines of, his wisdom fails him, but it's literally, his heart lessens. So I read this as meaning that a fool talks big game, but when he has to put his words into action, he cowers and blathers on in a foolish way, showing you that he never actually knew what he was talking about. I think this is then a warning against trying to sound more competent than you actually are. And now it's time for Rants with Colin, the part of the episode where Colin comes out and rants about something. None of us like to admit that we have no clue what's going on. We've all done this before, right? Somebody's just talking about some topic that you really have no clue what's going on, but you act like you do so that you fit into the conversation. And some things, that's not that big of a deal. You have your coworker at the water cooler and they're talking about the new pickup truck they got and all the specs on it, and you have no clue what any of it means, so you're just going, huh? Oh yeah, that sounds really fast. That sounds really strong. That's good horsepower right there. That's not that big of a deal. But remember, Qoheleth is talking here about people who are in positions of authority, particularly governance. And when they start to speak on topics that they are not actually informed on, bad things can happen because they have the power to make wrong decisions based on misinformation. And it's not just government authorities either. This should be a warning verse to all pastors and preachers. Don't act like you know what you're talking about or are an expert in an area you're not an expert on. If somebody has a particular medical condition, like let's say they get migraines all the time, they're not just going to go to a generic doctor. They're not going to go to some minute clinic down the road. And they're not going to go to a podiatrist, right? They're not going to go to somebody who specializes in treating cancer. They're going to go to somebody who specializes in dealing with migraines or a related field. There is a reason that we have specializations. And yet, whenever we put someone behind a pulpit, we think that they automatically become an authority on every possible topic in life. I think it's because so many evangelicals and fundamentalists view the Bible as a guidebook for life where this tells you everything that you need to know about life. And well, you're the guy standing up there who's telling us about this book, so you obviously know everything that there is to know about life. You have wisdom on every possible topic. So not only am I going to you every Sunday to hear about the Bible, I'm also going to you to hear marriage counseling. I'm also going to you to get job advice. I'm also going to you when I have a kid that's acting up, right? And we act as if pastors and preachers have experience and authority in every area just because they're preaching the Bible. And that's not the case. Now, I'm not saying that all pastors are no authority whatsoever. They should be. They should be skilled in teaching the Bible. But that doesn't automatically mean then that they are the person to go to for every single problem. Just like you wouldn't go to a dermatologist to fix your migraines, don't go to a pastor to fix your marriage problems unless they are actually a skilled and licensed family therapist, not just somebody who claims to know what they're talking about. And this is something that I'm probably going to get myself in trouble here, but people like John MacArthur do all the time. MacArthur is a theologian. Now, I disagree with a lot of his theology, but he is a very prominent and skilled theologian. That does not mean that he is a therapist or a psychologist, and yet he frequently speaks from his pulpit as if he is one. He speaks into mental health issues with very damaging advice, suggesting things that are not medically sound, are not psychologically sound, and are completely dismissive of people's problems, trying to give them this one size fits all cure all pill of Bible verses when that's not necessarily what everyone needs in a psychological setting. He is not a psychologist nor a psychiatrist and should not be listened to for those sorts of issues. And yet he constantly, even as recently as the last month or two, thinks that he has the authority to speak on those topics. And he's making a fool of himself and honestly a lot of Christianity. I cringe whenever I hear him speak on mental health stuff. So, minor side rant over there. Don't be like John MacArthur, okay? Don't think that you have authority on topics that you don't. Don't act as if you know more than you actually do. It takes humility and honesty, two things a Christian and especially a pastor should have. Sorry, I guess my rant isn't over yet. It takes humility and honesty to be able to say, I don't know, and you know what, that's not my area. Maybe we can find someone whose area that is, and we can listen to them together and try to learn together. That, I think, is what Qoheleth is trying to say here, is don't try to sound more competent than you actually are. It's okay to say, I don't know. Moving into verse 4, if the spirit of a ruler rise up against you, don't leave your place, because yielding pacifies great offenses. The Net Bible says that the point is either 1, a composed response can calm or appease the anger of the ruler, or 2, a calm heart will help one avoid great sins that could offend the king. Rather than resigning, i.e. leaving, composure can appease a king, i.e. cause the anger of the king to leave. Now, this verse revolves around the use of two words that are homonyms, and it's the words in English leave and yield. And they are coming from this Hebrew word that, again, you actually know. You just didn't realize you know. That's the word nuach. Now, if you listen to our Genesis, I believe is the 7 through 11 series, we mentioned how Noah's name in Hebrew is Noach. And when he was born, his father gave him that name playing on the Hebrew word nuach, that means rest. Same word here. And it could be that it's one word that has a couple of different meanings because in the one case it's translated leave, in the other it's yield. It's also possible that these are just homonyms where they're basically spelled the same or sound very similar, but they're actually separate words. Bruce Heitler observed, the phrase could be understood as, when the government arises against you, don't leave your place, because gentleness cures great wrongs. Alternatively, it could be, don't leave your place, since the cure makes even great wrongs depart. Perhaps what is essential is the ambiguity itself in the phrase, since we are often unable to discern whether gentleness and passivity is to be preferred, or actively getting out of the situation. End quote. And he brings up a good point there at the end, because there are some situations where it's better just to go with the flow, keep your mouth shut, and not say anything. And then there are other situations where it's best to stand up and make a point. But there is no one size fits all. If I just told you, well, always go with the flow, well, then you're going to be complicit in some stuff that you probably shouldn't be, and your ideas aren't going to be heard. You're going to be denying yourself what you actually believe. But if I say always stand up and make a scene, well, then you're going to end up doing that in times when you didn't necessarily need to. So it takes wisdom to discern when to speak out, when to sit down. Part of the problem with this verse is we have to consider, what does leave your place actually mean? When I first read it, I thought it may mean like stand your ground. Don't leave your place. Don't leave what you actually believe. Don't change on that. Don't waver on that. But the second half of the verse contradicts that, because he says yielding pacifies great offenses. So it actually seems that what he's saying is, don't leave your position there in the king's palace. It's assuming that the person in this illustration is in the king's royal court. And he's saying, if something happens and you end up on the king's bad side, don't run away. Stay where you are. Let him be angry, because your, if I can put it in the terms that Jesus would say, soft answer will turn away his wrath. Brown observes, anger met by anger only ensures needless conflict and destruction from the one who is stronger, which would be the ruler in this case. Through self-assurance and calm comportment, the king's subject does not escape accountability, but is rather prepared to face it, standing firm. Such composure, indeed, is the kind of bearing that Qoheleth advises his readers to assume in a world created by an all-powerful, inscrutable God. Such is the nature of pious fear, a fearless fear, as it were, as opposed to the terrible dread that inspires either paralysis or defiance. So in his reading of the text, the king isn't just capricious and angry at you for no reason. He's actually angry at something that you did, and he's saying that Qoheleth's advice is stand your ground. Take accountability for what you did and stand by your decision. And perhaps your boldness in that, your confidence in that, what he says, your calm comportment, will then impress the king. That's a possible reading. Murphy in the Word Biblical Commentary sees it this way. The admonition in this verse is less fearful than in chapter 8, verses 2 through 3, which you can go back to our series on Ecclesiastes 8 for that. We go into a whole thing about what it means to keep the king's commandment in regard to the oath of God and not be hasty to go out of his sight. We get into all of that. So if you haven't listened to that episode, you can go back and check that out. So Murphy goes on, the admonition of this verse is less fearful than chapter 8, verses 2 through 3, but no less diplomatic. At all costs, the courtier is to keep cool. Tranquility is a regular topic in the wisdom tradition. It's not clear whether the word for mistakes here are those of the ruler or courtier. A healing word and calm response can solve a touchy situation. Verse 4 can be loosely associated with verses 5 through 7 because of the officials envisioned, a ruler, the powerful, and a prince. End quote. I think the best takeaway here in this verse is to realize that people over you in authority are always going to get mad about something. And you can't control that. You're probably going to end up being the brunt of the bad day that somebody with more power than you had, and they just take it out on you. It might be at work, it could be a parent to a child, hopefully not in a church, but it can definitely happen with a pastor, where you just have somebody who is having a bad day and they take out their anger on you whether or not you deserve it. That is going to happen to all of us, and we easily get discouraged by that, particularly when somebody is mistreating us, right? It's upsetting when someone around us is angry, and then even more so when they mistreat us because of it, especially if we didn't do anything wrong. And especially in like a work environment, it's natural to want to quit from that. But if you stick it out, things will improve before too long. And since you stuck it out, you'll appear loyal and tenacious in front of your superiors. I think that's what Qoheleth was trying to get across here. But I do want to point out that this was not written with cases of abuse in mind, right? He is just speaking of people with little power in the presence of somebody with a lot of power. When you're a low man on the totem pole, there's not a lot you can do to change the situation. Sometimes it's better just to keep your head down. But when you have some agency, it can be better to actually stand up and make your case known. Sometimes putting your head down when you actually have the ability to push back a little just allows the problem to continue. And again, I want to emphasize this is not valid for cases of abuse. We can't just take something that somebody mentioned in the Bible and make it a one size fits all application for all time. This is just generic, pragmatic, practical wisdom that works most of the time, but not always. Given that the word for spirit here at the start of the verse, when the spirit of the ruler rises up against you, is the word breath, it's ruach. That makes me think that the implication is that the anger will pass if you're patient. Because anger, and honestly emotions in general, are like ruach. They're like breath. They're here one moment and gone the next. And so if we immediately respond to anger with anger, we're just going to create more anger. Anger plus anger equals more anger, anger squared. But if we respond peacefully, not necessarily passively, but peacefully, it prevents us from adding to the cycle of hurt and abuse. It allows us to step back and bring some healing into the situation just by not responding in kind. And again, I want to be very clear. I am not saying letting someone get away with abusive behavior. I am not saying, somebody steals $100 from you, you give them a plate of cookies. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying in a case where somebody is angry, they're just spewing vitriolic words, you respond with a calm demeanor. You don't rise to their same level, the same pitch of their voice, and you just respond calmly. It might infuriate them more for a little while, but it will eventually diffuse the situation. Ancient wisdom, but very practical. The next few verses here all go together, so let's look at these. There is an evil which I have seen under the sun, an error which proceeds from the ruler. Folly is set in great dignity, and the rich sit in low place. I have seen slaves upon horses, and princes walking as slaves on the earth. So, verse 5, when he says, there's an evil that I have seen under the sun, we recognize a few common phrases throughout the book so far. He talks about seeing an evil, a raw thing, a bad thing, a negative thing, a confusing thing. And then, of course, where does it happen? Under the sun. And error, and that word error, it's basically a wrongdoing that was committed in ignorance. So it's not an intentional misdeed. This is a mistake. But the verse isn't clear who makes the mistake, because you could read this as saying that the ruler is the one who made the mistake, claiming that the error is the evil that he mentions. Reading it that way would be, there is an evil that I have seen under the sun. It is an error which proceeds from the ruler. Or you could read him as saying that the evil is so great that it's comparable to when a ruler makes a mistake. So that way of reading it would be, there is an evil which I have seen under the sun, like when a ruler makes a mistake, like when an error proceeds from the ruler. In that case, the implication is, when somebody with a lot of power makes a mistake, it has bigger repercussions than if you or I make a mistake. So either reading is possible here. Now, there is a wonderful scholarly article here, and as I've mentioned before, scholarly articles they have nice scholarly names to them, right? You read the name and you're going, that sounds like some fantastic weekend reading. Okay, probably not for most of you, but for me anyway, it's interesting. So I came across this article by Brent Strawn, and it's called Arad Gula and Qoheleth, a new Assyrian parallel to Ecclesiastes 10, 5-7. Told you, it's riveting, right? Actually, it is pretty interesting. It's a little nerdy. Well, okay, it's a lot nerdy, but I'll include it in the show notes for anyone who wants to nerd out with me and check out that article. In the article, Strawn points to the genre of prophetic lament in ancient Egyptian literature, citing several ancient Egyptian works, including the prophecies of Nefertiti, the complaint of, oh boy, this is a fun name to read right here, Kakar. Anyone out there planning to have a kid anytime soon or know someone who is? That's a perfect baby name right there. Kakar. And if there's any Egyptologists listening to this right now, I apologize profusely for my pronunciation of this. I have no clue how it's supposed to be pronounced, so we're going with Kakar. And then the third work he references is the admonitions of Ipuwer, which, again, might be a horrible mispronunciation, but we're going with it. So these are all different works from ancient Egypt, long before the time of Ecclesiastes here. And they all share this common theme of a topsy-turvy world where somebody has had a horrible tragedy happen in their lives, and they speak as if the entire world has just turned on its head and everything is going bonkers, nothing is working the way it should. And you have princes as slaves and slaves as princes and dogs and cats living together and mass hysteria. So the point is that if you check most commentaries on this part of the chapter, they're going to say that Qoheleth is just talking about the world as it is, as he sees it around him, basically not going the way that he wishes it would. There's somebody in power that he doesn't agree with, and he thinks that they have completely turned the world upside down, and now everything that used to be good is now evil. But by drawing on these similar ancient genres of poetic or prophetic lament, we're able to see that this cosmic world ending sort of language he's using could actually just be a very dramatic, poetic way of saying that his own life felt this way. It doesn't necessarily have to refer to the world as a whole as much as just one person's experience being turned on its head, basically a riches to rags story. Similarly, there's another Egyptian work that Strawn points out, the Instruction of Ankh-Shashong, and it shares similar sentiments of how a god's judgment can be the cause of upheaval in a government. Strawn then goes on to draw on the Neo-Assyrian letter of Arad Gula, and this was fascinating. This is what Strawn was contributing to the discussion. This Arad Gula was an out-of-work exorcist. He used to work for the king, but something happened and he has been fired. And so he is writing to the new king, who was probably Ashurbanipal, that his whole world had been turned upside down, and he was requesting recompense from the king for his previous work there with the previous ruler. So Strawn believed that this is Qoheleth's formal complaint about how he himself had been deposed from a previous position of power. Really interesting take on it. And again, it's a nerdy article, but if you feel like wading into that, I'll link it in the show notes. Before we go any further with it, though, I want to highlight something that Brown brought up that I thought was really interesting. And it's that one man's upside down world looks right side up to another. So this is entirely subjective based on what side of the story you're on. He goes on to say, the prospect of a world gone mad is not something the sages take lightly. For others, however, a world on the brink of turbulent change is a source of wonder and testimony to the power of God's revolutionary ways. Hannah, for example, testifies to God's incomparable sovereignty as evinced in the reversal of social status. The Lord makes poor and makes rich. He brings low, he also exalts. He raises up the poor from the dust, he lifts the needy from the ash heap to make them sit with princes and inherit a seat of honor. See, that is the same kind of reversal language that Qoheleth is using, but whereas he is mourning it, Hannah is finding comfort in it. Brown continues, Hannah's testimonial to divine strength suggests the possibility that the ruler to whom Qoheleth credits the social reversals described in Ecclesiastes might be God. Yet, despite the apparent absurdity of such reversals, the sage seems to take pains to accept God's inscrutable handiwork, not to criticize it, much less reject it. Perhaps the most that this somber sage can muster is to indict this tumultuous state of affairs as a blunder of divine proportions. End quote. That really got me thinking that revolution and reform only look bad if you're the one with power that's being threatened. Especially given that the very next verse talks about the rich being brought low. That's actually a message of hope in much of the rest of the Bible. Remember that the majority of the biblical writers and the ancient Israelites, they didn't hold great power. They were often the people who were oppressed and abused and mistreated. They were often the recipients of injustice. And when that's you, you want to see revolution, you want to see change, you want to see reform. If you're the person with power, you don't want to see reform because that probably means you're no longer going to have power and you're going to be held accountable for what you have done. So it's just really interesting to me when you look at somebody's response to reform, it tells you a lot about what side they are actually on, whether they really want to help people or whether they really just want to hold on to their own power. And this might be a situation where Qoheleth is actually tipping his hand a little bit, and whether this is just his playing into the Solomonic persona, or maybe this was actually true of his life. It's possible he was actually a powerful person. Even if he wasn't Solomon, he could have still been some sort of government official or something like that, and he could have had the world completely turned upside down on him. At this point in his life, he's a sage, and like we've talked about before, wisdom doesn't pay well. You don't exactly make a lot of money just going around telling people, here's the best way you can live. Now, some people try to today, and there are definitely self help books and social media phenomenons of people trying to tell you how to live your life. But overall, if you actually have wisdom, you're not really going to make a ton of money off of it. So it's quite possible he is here publicly lamenting a loss of previous power. And as I mentioned earlier on, it's also possible that this could be read through the lens of the exile. Now, that's not necessarily guaranteed in this, it's not for certain, but if that is the case, it would definitely lean into a later date for the book, post exile, when he's talking about maybe even the princes of Israel walking as slaves into Assyria and or Babylon. We can't be sure that's what was intended here. It could just be more generic, but who knows? That might have been part of what inspired his insights here. Verse 8. He who digs a pit will fall into it, and whoever breaks a hedge, a serpent will bite him. Whoever removes stones will be hurt by them, and he who cleaves wood will be endangered by it. If the iron is blunt, and he doesn't whet the edge, he must put to more strength, but wisdom is profitable to direct. Surely the serpent will bite without enchantment, and a babbler is no better. The words of a wise man's mouth are gracious, but the lips of a fool will swallow himself. The beginning of the words of his mouth is foolishness, and the end of his talk is mischievous madness. A fool also is full of words. A man cannot tell what shall be, and what shall be after him. Who can tell him? The labor of the foolish wearies every one of them, because he doesn't know how to go into a city. Okay, this is definitely not a set of verses that's easy to read. The older English style doesn't exactly transfer the ideas over very well. And this is a good time to remind you that all translations are just that. They are translations. They have strengths, they have weaknesses. There is no such thing as a perfect translation. That doesn't mean that we can't trust our English Bibles. The majority of English Bibles out there are very trustworthy. They are written by scholarly, competent people who know what they're doing. But they can still have shortcomings. And particularly in obscure poetical books like this, you'll run into a lot of words that we don't really have a ton of known vocabulary for, particularly in older translations like the King James. We have had now 400 years since the writing of the King James, where we have discovered an incredible amount of writing from the ancient Near East that has helped us to understand the meaning of some of these words more. So we're going to definitely critique some of the translation choices here in these verses. That does not mean that the King James or any other version is a bad version to use. It's just a reminder that some terms are not going to mean what you think they mean, or even necessarily what the translators thought they meant. Bible translation, Bible study, Bible interpretation is a constantly dynamic, fluid study. We are constantly learning more about the ancient Near Eastern culture of the Bible. And when we do, we have to sometimes adjust what we think a verse means, because the context can change that. And that's not necessarily our fault for not knowing that. I mean, that's just what happens when you have a couple thousand years and half a world apart from those people. We're going to have things that aren't translated great because we misunderstood what they meant. That's not necessarily the fault of the translators either. It's just fact. We have more information now than we did before. And so we continue to build upon previous study. I'm not saying that all previous older Bible translations are bad. They are a fantastic foundation that we are only able to be where we're at today because we had those works. So we've built on them, and we continue to improve and refine our understanding of the Bible as time goes on. So I'd encourage you, especially if you came from a tradition like I did, don't be afraid of change. Don't be afraid of newer Bible versions, newer interpretations of the Bible. I was raised with this, if it's new, it ain't true. If it's true, it ain't new mindset. And I get it. I get why people say that. But that's not always the case. Just because something is new to you does not mean it is a completely novel interpretation. That is a very me centered understanding. Just because something sounds new to me, I reject it as something new. It can actually be something very old and just something that is new to me because I never heard it before. So let's keep an open mind as we go into these next several verses and realize that what we think the translation might be saying is actually the opposite of what the verse is trying to read in the original Hebrew. Here's a perfect example of what I mean. Verse 8. The King James translation put this in a future indicative. That means that it's saying this will happen in the future. Not this is happening, not this did happen, this will happen. And that usually implies a sense of certainty, particularly for people who are used to reading the Bible as a guidebook. If they see will or shall, they tend to think, oh, this means it must happen this way. Like the Bible is saying it will happen, it is certain because God said it. So you see how just a simple choice of tense in a translation can lead people to read the verse one particular way. The way the King James, and honestly a handful of other translations, puts it, it's very much read as if this is what is going to happen. Whoever digs a pit will fall into it. Whoever breaks a hedge, a serpent shall bite him, right? Like this is guaranteed to happen. However, that's not the way that this verse probably should have been translated. It shouldn't be a future indicative, it should be a subjunctive. When I realize that's nerdy grammar talk, put into easy English, rather than should or shall or will, it should be might or may. So rather than whoever digs a pit will fall into it, whoever breaks a hedge, a serpent shall bite him, it should be whoever digs a pit may fall into it. Whoever breaks a hedge, a serpent might bite him. That sort of thing. See, while digging a pit is a common biblical metaphor for plotting harm against another person, you'll see that in Proverbs a lot, it doesn't have to mean that in every single instance, and it likely doesn't here. See, there is nothing morally wrong with digging a pit. Sometimes you have to dig a hole. There's nothing morally wrong with tearing down a wall. Or anything that he mentions in these verses. The next couple of verses, moving stones, chopping wood. There's nothing morally wrong with those things. But by choosing to put these in a future indicative rather than a subjunctive tense, by saying will or shall rather than may or might, it's subtly suggesting that Qoheleth is saying these are negative things. Like, if you dig a pit, you deserve to fall into it. If you break down a wall, you deserve to be bitten by a snake. But that's not what he's saying. That's not what Qoheleth is saying at all. He is not saying that whatever you do, you are guaranteed to have it come back on you. He is saying that every single action, even harmless ones, like digging a hole, like tearing down a wall, like moving stones, like chopping wood, even those activities all bring with them a measure of risk and reward. This is a really important principle to grasp. Every activity brings both a measure of risk and a measure of reward, and we have to weigh the two against each other to see what is worthwhile. I have known people who are extremely anxious and worried about every little thing that could possibly go wrong. They won't fly because they're afraid of a plane crash. They won't drive in a busy city because they're afraid of a car crash. Or, they won't do any number of things because of the potential risk. But the reality is, there is no such thing as a completely risk adverse action in life. You could sit walled in your house constantly and you could have a heart attack. You could have a car crash into your house. You could go out to get the mail and a car could hit you, right? There's any number of things. I'm not trying to, be some doom and gloom voice here to scare you, but I'm just trying to be realistic that there is no such thing as a risk adverse action. Simply by breathing, we have some risk that we could stop breathing. And there definitely are some things that bring with them more risk than others, absolutely. But if you're the sort of person who never does anything outside of your comfort zone because you're afraid of the risk, you're not living life. Everything has risk. That cannot be avoided. That doesn't mean that you have to take every single risk out there, but if you never take any risks, you never get any reward either. I think that's what Qoheleth is trying to say with these verses, that even something as simple as digging a hole in your backyard or breaking down a wall, you're risking some sort of physical injury. That's not saying that you should never do those things. It's just saying you should be prepared. As I was studying this, I cracked up at what Murphy said in the Word Biblical Commentary. He says the connection between walls and serpents is not at first obvious until one recalls that the mortar in ancient walls and buildings of Israel would be any kind of small loose fill in which a serpent might readily lurk. Now, that's a nice, helpful piece of information. But the fact that he says it's not at first obvious until one recalls this, I'm just going, how many people know what kind of quote unquote mortar was used in ancient Israelite walls that they can now recall it? Like that does not sound like something the average person would know, but apparently he thinks it is. Moving into verse 10. The word for blunt there, if the iron be blunt, and that's suggesting basically an axe head. The word for blunt, keha, is used only 3 other times in the Tanakh, all in the repeated colloquial proverb from Jeremiah and Ezekiel that, quote, the fathers have eaten sour grapes, but the children's teeth are set on edge. And that set on edge is this same word, keha. In the proverb from Ezekiel and Jeremiah, it's basically what the people are trying to say in it is that their parents are the problem. Their parents' generation are the reason that they ended up in exile, but we're suffering for it in this generation. So the fathers ate sour grapes, but we're the ones whose lips puckered because of it. So that same idea of having teeth tingling or lips puckered is the same word here of a blunt edge of an axe. Now, wet the edge is literally curse the face in Hebrew. So, if the iron is blunt and he does not curse the face, he has to put more strength into his chopping. You might say, where in the world do we get curse the face from wet the edge? Like, how do we get to that point? Well, throughout the Bible, particularly in the Tanakh, the Old Testament in Hebrew, swords or knives or any kind of sharpened instrument, the edge of it, what we would say is the edge, they actually use the word mouth or face. There's quite frequently in the Tanakh an image of a sword devouring. And in some older translations, like the King James, you may even read something along the lines of the edge of the sword devoured or something like that. Well, it's actually literally the mouth of the sword devoured. So it has this imagery of a sword eating life. So that's where we get mouth or face there. And then wet is actually the idea of sharpening. And the Hebrew word is kalal. It's going to show up a couple of times in this chapter, and it most literally means to make something small or insignificant, but it's most frequently used in the sense of cursing someone. And with a little bit of thought, you can see where we get from one to the other, because if you are cursing someone, you are belittling them. You are making them small in your sight. And particularly, I'm not just saying cursing at someone like 4-letter words, but actually cursing in the sense of almost like voodoo, like wishing a curse upon them. You are trying to lessen their impact. You are trying to discourage them, make them smaller in their reach, if you will. And so you kind of have that idea of how you get from make smaller and significant to curse. Well, if you are sharpening a knife's edge, you are making it smaller. You are thinning it out. So that's why we have that word there. But I just thought it was interesting that whetting the edge of the sword, or rather sharpening the edge of the axe, is literally curse the face of the axe. So this verse is basically the ancient version of work smarter, not harder. Rather than chopping away with a blunt axe, put a little bit of extra effort in first, sharpen the axe, and then you'll actually have to put in less effort later. Now, the way it's translated in English, the last bit of this verse doesn't make a ton of sense. Wisdom is profitable to direct. What the heck does that mean? Well, literally, it reads, but the wisdom to use something properly is yitron. Now, if you've been listening to this series, first off, thank you for sticking with us. I realize we've had some really deep material here in Ecclesiastes, but you might remember that early on we talked about some key words in Ecclesiastes. One of them was the word prophet, not like a prophet who preaches, but a prophet as in something left over, something remaining, something in the plus side on the books. And Qoheleth is constantly searching for some yitron, some profit, some remainder, something that lasts beyond this life. And he doesn't find a lot of that. But here he does. He says that wisdom is profitable. Wisdom is yitron. Well, what kind of wisdom? The wisdom to use something properly. I think this explains the previous part of the verse. Any old person can take an axe and just start swinging and try to brute force a tree down. But a wise man is going to look at that and say, maybe we should sharpen the edge first and take a little time to do that, and then it's going to take less time in the long run. The wisdom to use something properly has yitron, it has benefit, it pays off more in the end. It's something that will last. It's like the gift that keeps on giving. The New Jewish Publication Society translated it as, thus the advantage of a skill depends on the exercise of prudence or wisdom. Moving into verse 11, the King James translators again here really misunderstood the implied subjunctive. And I promise I am not trying to hate on the King James. It's just this is what I grew up on. This is what we base our translation off of that we read here on the podcast because it's kind of an easy starting point for everyone. It's like a least common denominator. So if it seems like I'm picking on the King James a lot, it's just because that's our standard that we're going by, since that's what so many people are familiar with. It is a overall very good version. Definitely outdated, but it is one of the most beautiful and poetic English versions ever made. And I'm not trying to say I am smarter than these translators. Many of them knew several languages very well early on, but we do have better resources now than they did back then. And part of that is because of the work that they put in. So we can honor their work by improving on it. And part of that is recognizing where they could have made a better decision. And this is definitely one of those cases. Both verse 10 and verse 11 begin with the same word in Hebrew. It's just a simple conjunction or preposition, and it's a pretty flexible word. What they translate in verse 11 as surely, that is a legitimate grammatical possibility. But within context, it doesn't make sense. They said if in verse 10, and if makes more sense here in verse 11 as well. Yet again, they translated it as a future indicative. The serpent will bite without enchantment. Well, that's not a guarantee. It's actually the same subjunctive idea. The serpent can bite, the serpent might bite, the serpent may bite. We don't know if it's going to or not. That's the problem. Qoheleth is working in an unpredictable world, and to add predictability into it, to add certainty into it, is to totally miss what he's trying to say. Most translations rightly understand this word "eam" here to be if. It is anything but certain that a snake will bite without a snake charmer. The purpose of these verses is to say that anything can happen and nothing is guaranteed. There's definitely some wordplay going on here in this verse because the word for serpent or snake is a word that you know, at least if you were listening to our Genesis 1 through 6 series. It's that word nakash. Now, I don't want to make too much of a Genesis Garden of Eden connection here, with the nakash in the garden, because sometimes nakash can just mean serpent, and I don't think Qoheleth here is necessarily trying to draw on Eden imagery. But there is another word that sounds really similar to it, and it's the word translated enchantment here, and that's lakash. So we have nakash and lakash together, really just the difference of one letter. So I think there's definitely some wordplay going on there. Unfortunately, though, the end of verse 11 is not a great translation either, because it says, a babbler is no better. See, when I read babbler, I think of someone who has no clue what they're talking about. Qoheleth actually had the exact opposite in mind here. This verse literally reads, if a nakash can bite without being charmed, then there is no yitron, there we go with that prophet, that leftover word again, there is no yitron to a lord of the tongue. All right, that's a little translation, a lord of the tongue. That does not sound like a babbler, okay? Lord of the tongue could just mean someone who is a skilled orator, possibly even a polyglot, someone who knows a lot of languages. But it also has the connotation of a magician, not in the Penn and Teller sense, but in the ancient magician, sorcerer sort of idea. An enchanter, someone who knows the right incantations to receive supernatural information from snakes. This is about to get weird here, folks, so take a breath and hold on, because we are about to dive into some ancient Near Eastern culture that you did not know you needed to know to understand this chapter. We have been talking here a little bit about snake charming, whether you realized it or not. In verse 8, talked about a serpent biting the person who breaks down a hedge. Now we have a snake biting without enchantment. And that word lakash, it has the idea of like whispering to the snake, having some sort of incantation or amulet, some sort of magic to protect against the snake's power. Our modern concept of snake charming comes from ancient India, and it's mostly just seen as a novelty, kind of akin to a carnival attraction. But other ancient cultures, such as Egypt and Greece, practiced snake charming as a form of divination. And one of mythology's most famous snake charmers is the Greek god Asclepius. Now, even if you're not familiar with his name, I guarantee you have seen his symbol. You know the symbol of Asclepius. It's his staff, or sometimes it's called his rod, Asclepius's rod. It's a staff, a stick, with a snake wrapped around it. Can you think of anywhere you've seen a symbol, a shield, a logo with a staff, a pole maybe, and a snake wrapped around it? Yeah, it is a standard symbol of the medical profession in America and several other countries as well. Here in America, it's been at least since the early 1800s, possibly before that. Now, it's similar to, albeit different from, a staff with two intertwined snakes. That's known as a caduceus. That rod was used by the Greek god Hermes and is also sometimes associated with medical professionals and used as a symbol for that. And there's kind of an ongoing debate about whether the staff of Asclepius or the staff of Hermes, known as the caduceus, is the better representation. But that's a whole other issue that is beyond the scope of this podcast. Going back to Asclepius, though, he began his life as a mortal and was eventually elevated to the status of a god. He was worshipped in ancient Greece, and the worship of him peaked around the time of Qoheleth. Now, he became such a popular mythic figure because, as the story goes, at one point he had a snake share with him healing power or insights into how to heal himself and others. Interestingly enough, there are fascinating parallels to Jesus' own birth story as well, with the story of Asclepius. Asclepius was the son of a god, born to a human mother, and had the ability to raise the dead. So that's quite the rabbit trail you can go down someday. But just going back here to Qoheleth, he's talking about a serpent biting without enchantment. This isn't just talking about some carnival parlor trick where, you're trying to dance along with a snake. By the way, the snake can't actually hear the music in snake charming. It's more so just feeling the vibrations of the music, so it has nothing to do with the actual song that's being played. It's more so following the motions of the snake charmer. It's kind of like matadors with the bulls, and we'd always say, oh, you have to wave the red cloth. And if you grew up on like Bugs Bunny cartoons and stuff, that you always have to have the red tablecloth or something in front of the bull and they go chasing after it. A lot of people say that bulls are actually colorblind, and so the color doesn't matter. What matters is the motion. That's what upsets them. Same thing with the snake here. It's not the particular song, it's actually the motion of the snake charmer. But that's a little aside that you didn't necessarily need to know, just me being nerdy. That's not the kind of snake charming that we're talking about here in this verse. It's not some parlor trick. They're actually talking about an ancient practice, probably based on ancient Egyptian sorcerers like Pharaoh had in his court. Remember something back in Exodus about their controlling snakes and staffs? And okay, all right. Keep that in mind. We're going to come back to that in just a second. So possibly drawing on stuff like that, or even the myth of Asclepius, it's quite possible that Qoheleth would have known about Asclepius mythology at this point. So this is the sort of thing he's talking about, is basically ophiomancy, the belief that you can get divine wisdom from serpents, that you can somehow divine supernatural understanding from these creatures. Isn't it interesting then that there's a story that our Bible starts out with a couple of people getting divine knowledge from a nakash, a serpent? Ophiomancy. So interesting, right? To us, because we only read the Bible, we think, oh, that's weird, talking snakes. What are we doing here? Well, ancient people actually believed in and practiced ophiomancy sometimes. There were certain cultures where they thought that particular animals could offer bits of wisdom if you knew how to listen to them. Kind of like Harry Potter, right? And I think it was the first movie when he realizes that he can hear the snake and it breaks out of the exhibit at the zoo. That's the sort of thing we're talking about here. So let's return back to the literal translation of the verse I gave. If a nakash, a snake, a serpent, can bite without being charmed, there is no yitron to a lord of the tongue, to a snake charmer, to an enchanter, to someone who practices ophimancy. So, in other words, it doesn't matter how skilled you are, that does not guarantee your success. Even the best snake charmer gets bitten sometimes. Even the best sorcerer's magic eventually runs out. This verse is a warning not to rest on your past laurels. Just because you've won in the past, just because you've been the best at something, doesn't mean that you are continually going to be good at that. You can't make your life constantly living in the past. We all know someone like that, right? Where the best days of their lives were in high school or college, and they're constantly just reliving their glory days there through memories or trying to act like they did back then. It's like, eventually you got to move on. You got to find some new victory in life. You have to do something new with your life. You can't just rest on the way things used to be. No amount of skill can guarantee success. We all have bad days, and just because you were the best at something yesterday doesn't mean you're still going to be today. Murphy says, this also calls for the use of technical skill, in this case, snake charming. The point of the saying is that even the experts fail if they do not apply their skill. The advantage, or yitron, lies in exercising one's ability. I'll include a link in the show notes to another scholarly article here. And if you thought the name of the previous one was a mouthful, get a load of this one. Of snakes and sinners, there's always a subheading. Whenever you have an academic article, one title is never good enough. We always have to have a subheading. So it's of snakes and sinners, an intertextual reading of Baal Halashon in Ecclesiastes 10:11 in light of Ish Halashon in Psalm 140, verse 12. That is longer than some sentences right there. But it is an interesting article, and again, it's another really nerdy one. But in that article, Dr. Forti draws on some really interesting parallels with other biblical passages where terminology about someone being a master of the tongue or something along those lines is used in comparison to a foolish man or sometimes even a wicked man's words being venomous. So there's a connection between a snake and even sometimes a snake charmer and somebody who is duplicitous in their words. It gets into some interesting connections that I don't want to bog down this particular episode on too much, but she does give a little bit more background into the ideas that I'm talking about in these few verses here. Okay, how we feeling so far? I know this has been some dense material so far in this chapter. There's a lot of ancient Near Eastern culture, and whenever we have to learn a lot of that, it can be exhausting because that's not the sort of stuff we're used to when we've been trained to read the Bible like modern day Americans. This really gets our Bible reading muscles working. So let's just take a quick breather here and look at something fun for a second in verse 12. The words of a wise man's mouth are gracious, but the lips of a fool will swallow up himself. Now, remember, a few minutes ago we talked about ancient Egypt, Pharaoh, the magicians or sorcerers in his court who had their staves turn into serpents, right? Remember that story from Exodus. Well, this word for swallow up himself is the same word from Exodus 7 when Aaron's staff turned snake swallowed up the snake staves of Pharaoh's sorcerers. The exact same word. So, right after we're talking about snake charming, we get the same word used in Exodus 7. Beautiful biblical hyperlink right there. Net Bible notes say, to consume him or engulf him, this particular verb creates a striking wordplay on the homonymic root to speak eloquently. Rather than speaking eloquently, the fool utters words that are self-destructive. So it's the Hebrew root bala. And in some cases, the word can mean to speak eloquently. In other cases, it means to swallow up. So there's wordplay going on there. I think this is kind of like the ancient version of better to remain silent and be thought a fool than to speak and remove all doubt. Now, we have no clue who actually said that. It's been attributed to a bunch of different people, and probably none of them are true. But in studying this, it did get me thinking about how many common aphorisms are about just shutting up and not making a scene. Don't make any waves, don't rock the boat, just go along with it. Whether it's better to remain silent and be thought a fool than speak and remove all doubt, or something as simple as children should be seen and not heard. We have so many different phrases that are just about don't make a scene. And the more I thought about it, the more it started to make sense why those sorts of sayings are so common. Because people with power don't want the apple cart to be upset. Now, we've talked about that several times in this episode already, whether it was, talking about politics and who wants reform versus who wants status quo, or looking at Qoheleth's topsy-turvy upside-down world, when that is entirely dependent on whether you're in power or not, and whether you think that the world is the way it's supposed to be or not. Isn't it so funny how when we get a Republican president in the White House, all of a sudden the conservatives think, oh, we're regaining America, and the liberals think, oh, we've lost everything. And then when we get a Democrat in the White House, the conservatives think, oh, the world has now turned upside down, we're going to hell in a handbasket. And the liberals think, oh, okay, well, now we're starting to get back on track. It completely depends on whose side of the story you're on. And it works the same way for these sayings, too. People with power don't want people without power to speak against them. And since history is written by the victors, and throughout most of human history, you had to be extremely powerful to even have your words written down in the first place, it only makes sense that the prevailing wisdom we would have is don't make a scene. Because when you don't have a lot of power, making a scene is probably just going to get you more trouble than it's worth. But in our more individualized culture today, as we have started to give more power and voice to people who haven't had that, basically anyone who isn't a straight white Christian male, we're equalizing the playing field, and the prevailing wisdom is starting to change from sit down, shut up, put your head down, and don't make a scene, to actually speak out, make a difference, and call out wrong when it has happened. I realize there are extremes on either side. I'm not saying that we should go to a full extreme and just constantly make a scene all of the time, but it's just so interesting to me how many Christians are scared of the change that's happening in the world as there is a democratization of power, when that's actually an extremely Christian thing. Was it not Paul who said that in God's family there is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male or female? He's tearing down these labels, these dividing walls, these categories, these binaries that we have had throughout most of human history, and saying that when you're following Jesus, there should be a level playing field. We should be trying to bring equality for everyone. So I don't think that's something that Christians should be afraid of. And if we are afraid of it, that's just telling that we are the ones who have had power. A lot of Christians like to have a martyr complex, saying that the world is trying to attack us and take away our voice and we're persecuted. Not in America, we're not. Now, we're not as much privileged as we used to be. We don't have the same stereotype of everyone going to church that we did back in the 1800s or, even the 1950s. But that doesn't mean that Christianity is persecuted. It just means that we no longer have some of the privilege that we used to. Loss of privilege is not the same thing as persecution. We've been moving toward a more level playing field for all human beings, even the ones who don't live like we do, or don't believe like we do, or don't have the same lifestyle that we do. And that's a good thing. We shouldn't be seeking equality and power and privilege only for people who are like us. We should be seeking equality for all people, whether we agree with them or not. And that means that the people who had privilege and power beforehand have to be willing to give up a little bit of that to make up room for the other people to come in. So if you're one of these people who is pushing back against democratization of power in today's culture, that's only because you have the privilege of already having so much assumed power. And you're probably straight, white, likely male, and likely Christian. And of course, there is absolutely nothing wrong with being straight, white, Christian, or male. But we have to realize that there is inherent privilege and power that comes with that we don't necessarily realize because we have that. That's kind of the definition of a blind spot, right? Is it's a blind spot because you don't realize it's there until someone calls it out. And we can be ashamed when blind spots get called out because we don't like to think that we've missed that all along. But going back, bringing it all back, see, this is all tied together. It's like poetry, it rhymes. This goes back to the very beginning of the episode when we're saying that it takes humility and honesty to be able to say, maybe I got this wrong. Maybe I haven't been making as much room for people who aren't exactly like me as I thought I did. That's not something that should scare us as Christians. That's something that we should be welcoming as Christians. Verse 13, the beginning of the words of his mouth is foolishness. That's talking about a fool. And the end of his talk is mischievous madness. Literally, the end of the verse would say, the result of his mouth is foolish evil. Basically, from start to finish, a fool is foolish. That's kind of a truism there, right? But there is something that I just wanted to share with you at the very, no pun intended, beginning of this verse, and it's the word beginning, because this just cracked me up as I was doing this study here. You know what the Hebrew word is for beginning used there? Now, no, it is not actually the one from Genesis 1:1. So if you were thinking Genesis 1:1 in the beginning, Bereshit, good guess. No, that is not the word. No joke, I am not making this up. You can check me on this. The Hebrew word for beginning here is tequila. Now, it's going to be pronounced a little more like tequila, but if someone ever asks, now I don't know why they would ask this, but if they ever ask, do you know any Hebrew? You can say, yes, tequila. Tequila is biblical, right? So the next time Cinco de Mayo rolls around, just remember, tequila is biblical. And lest anyone take me seriously, no, they are nowhere near the same word. Tequila, the drink, is named after the region. This is a very separate Hebrew word, totally different etymology, but they do sound alike. Verse 14. A fool also is full of words. A man can't tell what will be, and what will be after him. Who can tell him? So the idea of this verse is that you can know a fool by how certainly he speaks. See, a fool is full of words. I like the little English play on words there. Literally, it's a fool is of many words. A fool has lots of words. But I like the play of a fool is full. So he speaks a lot. That is the defining point of a fool. He just talks way too much. He thinks he knows everything. He is so certain about this. You say, well, where does the idea of certainty come in? Well, because of Qoheleth's response. No one can know what will be and what's going to come after us. Who can tell him that? So he's responding to the fool's foolishness with lots of words by saying, we can't actually know what's going to happen. So I think that implies that the fool's fullness of speech is certainty. Again, I hate to harp on Christian leaders so much here, but I'm only doing it because I trained to be one and I have a platform here, and hey, this is what the text is saying. So if you're mad at what I'm saying, don't get mad at me, get mad at Qoheleth, because he's the one who wrote it this way. Especially if you are in a position of Christian leadership, you need to be so careful. And I'm not just talking pastors, I'm talking even Christian parents to their children. Or it can be anyone. It doesn't have to be Christian. I'm just assuming that the majority of our audience here is. Not everyone is, which is awesome. If you are not a Christian, so glad you are listening to this. I hope you find it helpful, and I'd love to hear from you, dialogue with you over this, and hear your side of this and your take on it as someone coming from a different position in this. This is not just a podcast for Christians. But, as a Christian myself, I think that it's really important that we don't press certainty as much as the way I was raised. Certainty was like the absolute defining point of our faith. You had to be 100% certain about everything. And no one actually is. That's been a huge point that Qoheleth has consistently tried to make in this book, is there's little in life that we actually know for sure. You can't game the system. You can't figure out the pattern. You can't get a glimpse at the code behind life's operating system. Qoheleth's words are an indictment on so much of fundamentalism. He says blatantly that you will know a foolish person by how certainly they speak. Here we go again. It takes wisdom, it takes humility, it takes honesty to be able to say, I don't know. And to be okay with that. to be able to rest in the fact that you don't have to have 100% certainty about everything in life. That doesn't mean you can't believe things. That doesn't mean you can't have faith in things. I believe in things. I have faith in things, but that doesn't mean that I am automatically certain about it. And I don't want to lie to someone else and say that I am, because then that creates a culture like the one I grew up in where people are ostracized if they start to have any doubts. Because you can't have doubt if your community is centered in certainty. You can have doubt if your community is centered in faith, but not if it's centered in certainty. And it's just so telling about how many of our churches, they say they're faith communities, but they're actually certainty communities. And you can tell the difference based on how people with questions are treated. If they are welcomed in, if they are allowed to have dissonance in their belief system, if they're allowed to ask the difficult questions, if those questions are welcomed and not just brushed off or given pat, simple Bible verse answers, well, then that might actually be a faith community. But if they are constantly ignored or pushed to the side or, blacklisted from service in a Christian ministry or given those pat answers, that's not a faith community. That's a certainty community. And that's one of the first steps heading toward a cult. So even though I don't know that he meant it this way, Qoheleth is protecting us from bad religious practices right here. Verse 15. The labor of the foolish wearies every one of them. That English translation really kind of confuses me because, well, every one of who? And I think it's implied that they're trying to say the foolish. It's a really weird grammatical setup there, and I'll explain why in a second. Because he knows not how to go to the city. That's yet another really awkward grammatical construction. So let's look at this verse, and I want to draw in what the Net Bible notes have here because I think it's helpful in understanding. They say the plural form of hakasalim, the word for fool, so they're pointing out that this is not just a singular fool. This is actually the plural word for fool here. It denotes either the plural of number, referring to several fools, makes sense. Secondly, it can mean a plural of habitual character or plural of intensity. I know we're getting into some really nerdy grammatical stuff here, so stick with me. But they're suggesting that the plural can refer to a single person who is characterized by continual actions of foolishness. And they actually suggest that that is the better understanding because then the verbs that are used in the next part of the verse are singular. So it's a plural subject with singular verbs. And that only kind of makes sense if we then take the subject as actually being singular and just being intensive. Oh, that's interesting. So they give us more practical understanding of it now. They say this line can then be interpreted in one of three ways. First, the labor of fools wearies him because he didn't know enough to go to a town. That would then refer to the labor of peasants who hadn't been able to find a place in town where life was easier. And that was really interesting to me because that makes sense in an ancient context. A lot of people would have been really poor, basically peasants who don't even have enough to make it to the town to try to get a better life. And that's actually something that still happens today, even here in America. It's really easy for us to believe in the American dream when we already have enough money in our pockets to do okay in a middle class situation. But there are people here who are so poorly off that they can't even follow the American dream. They don't have enough to get to those next steps to get them further along. And that's a real problem with our current economy and system of governments. And promise I'm not trying to be super political with this episode, but like we mentioned earlier, there are a lot of political things in this chapter because he's talking about rulers and government and people in government before people with more power. So we kind of have to address it. That's the way the Bible works. You just go verse by verse through it like this, and you're gonna reach some thorny topics. And I'm not in the business here of ignoring those. That's what too many churches do. They just give you the verses that are familiar, that you like, that you know, and they try to skip over the scary stuff. That's the kind of stuff that we want to focus on here, because that's often where the important stuff of the Bible is. Anyway, getting back to the Net Bible notes. The first option was that the fool isn't even able to get into town. So in that case, it might not be that he is morally foolish as much as just he is not able to make anything out of his life. Option 2, the labor of fools so wearies every one of them so much that he doesn't even know how to get to town. In other words, he doesn't even know how to do the easiest thing in the world. He is so dumb, he can't even find his way to the town. That's an option. Third option, let the labor of fools so weary him that he may not even know how to get to town. That takes the verb as a jussive, describing the foolish man. Those are all possible translation options. As I looked at this, though, I came away with a different translation, and I think a different application. A literal translation of this verse would be, foolish anxiety wearies he who doesn't know how to walk to a city. I think the implication is that this person, for whatever reason, doesn't have the basic knowledge of how to get to the nearest city. And yet he is worried about so many different things that aren't even relevant to his situation because he can't get to the city. Like, that is the first step. He needs to figure out how to get to the city, and then he can worry about the other stuff. But instead, he is just worried about all of these different things, and he is now anxious over stuff when he hasn't even figured out the first step. See, it's foolish to worry about things that are outside of your control. I think this is a message that many of us need to hear. I know that I do sometimes. We can get so caught up worrying about stuff that's never going to happen. There are so many great quotes about this topic. There were many terrible things in my life, and most of them never happened. I have spent most of my life worrying about things that have never happened. Worry doesn't fix the problem. It only robs you of the present moment. I've got 99 problems, and 6 of them are completely made up scenarios in my head that I'm stressing about for absolutely no logical reason. And one of my personal favorites, I know worrying works, because none of the stuff I've worried about has ever happened. It's so true, though. We spend so much of our lives anxiously worrying about, oh, what's going to happen in this situation or that situation, or what if this... I mean, just think about it. Stop and think for a second about something that concerns you, something that worries you, something you're anxious about. How long have you been worried about that? All right? Has it happened yet? I can guarantee you with near 100% accuracy that the answer is no. Because if it had happened, you would no longer be worried about it. It wouldn't be a worry anymore. It would just be something that you dealt with because it already happened. Anxiety is just concern over something that has not come to pass yet. It's worrying about a potential future. It's taking time in the present to worry about something that could very likely never actually happen. I realize some people are more prone to anxiety than others, and this isn't just the sort of thing you can, flip off like a switch, or just the classic, hey, stop worrying so much. Yeah, that definitely has helped people stop worrying over the years, right? It's like saying, calm down. That works 100% of the time to calm people down, right? Absolutely not. So I'm not trying to give just simple pat, hey, don't worry about it anymore. Stop stressing so much. No, I understand. As somebody who does deal with anxiety sometimes, it's not always that simple. But for a lot of us, there are just so many things that we stress over that we don't need to because they're probably never going to happen. I'm not saying we should never think through future scenarios, but if all you do is worry about this or that in the future, you're not living in the present, and you're not guaranteed to get the future, and you're almost guaranteed not to get the future that you're worrying about. Think about all the stuff you've worried about in the past. How many times did life actually work out that way? How many times did you actually have to have that conversation with your boss? How many times did you actually get into that car accident? How many times did whatever it is that you worry about, how many times did that situation actually happen? I would wager very, very few, if any. So if your track record is that bad about the stuff that you think is worth worrying about, maybe you should just hang it up and quit trying to do something that you suck so much at. Stop trying to become an expert worrier because you obviously aren't good at it. Just let life happen. And again, for anyone dealing with actual chronic anxiety, please realize I'm not trying to belittle your situation. I understand that is a different thing. But for many of us, there is at least some measure of worrying and stress that we have an element of control over, and that we can at least try to improve that little area. I think that's part of what Qoheleth is trying to share with us here. All right, last few verses here of the chapter, verses 16 through 20. Woe to you, O land, when your king is a child, and your princes eat in the morning. Blessed are you, O land, when your king is the son of nobles, and your princes eat in due season, for strength and not for drunkenness. By much slothfulness the building decays, and through idleness of the hands the house drops through. A feast is made for laughter, and wine makes merry, but money answers all things. Curse not the king, no, not in your thought, and curse not the rich in your bedchamber, for a bird of the air will carry your voice, and that which has wings will tell the matter. Very mysterious. That last verse, that's the last stuff we're going to get into this week, and oh boy, that might be my favorite part of the episode so far. Just totally blew my mind as I was doing that study. But we still have a couple verses to go before we get there. So, verse 16. Depending on what English version you're using, you may have a different word there for child. A lot of English versions say child. Some say childish. Some say servant. Some say slave. The New Jerusalem Publication Society said lackey. The Net Bible points out that when used in reference to rulers, it emphasizes incompetence, naivety, inexperience, and immaturity. So there's a debate about whether this actually means that the king of this land is a child, or if it means that the king of this land is childish. He is someone who is immature, inexperienced, naive, incompetent even. Any of those options are possible. Different translations take different routes with that. What is not a great translation is the way that I heard this growing up, which was the implication that young people should never be given any position of authority. And by young people, I pretty much mean anyone under like 40 to 50. And I saw this a lot in the church circles that I grew up in. It was really taboo to have a pastor that was under the age of 40, or even a deacon or an elder. You would get a little bit of an eyebrow raise if the guy was in his 30s. And God forbid somebody at my age as a pretentious teenager or, in my 20s tries to have any sort of position of leadership in the church, like actual position of staff leadership, not just, maybe like a Sunday school teacher or an usher or something like that. Well, that's just, that's not good because, woe to any land whose king is a child. We don't want young people in authority. Well, I don't think the point is that the young person is in authority. Yeah, I think the point is the maturity of the person, the capability of the person. And if you read the historical books in the Tanakh, one of the best kings that Judah had was a child king, Josiah. Even King David was chosen to rule at a young age. Now, granted, it took several years for him to actually rule, but he was chosen to rule and in an ideal situation would have been able to at that young age when he was anointed. And he started leading around people at that age as well, or at least pretty early on, when he had to run from Saul. And this whole idea that you have to have white hair in order to lead anything just isn't accurate. And again, in the churches I grew up in, you wanted your pastor to be at least in his 40s, usually 50s, or heck, most of the time it was 60s or 70s in those churches. Well, what about Jesus? What age did he start his ministry at? Right? What about the Levitical priests in the Tanakh and the Torah? At what point did they start their ministering in the temple and tabernacle? Age 30. We need to stop berating young people just for being young people. I mean, isn't that what Paul said for Timothy not to let happen? Let no man despise your youth. And yet that's what a lot of churches, and it's not just churches, it's any institution. I mean, heck, you go for a job today and they say, what? You need certain number of years of experience. Well, how do you get that kind of experience? By having that sort of job. And you're in this catch-22 of you need the experience to have the job and you need the job to have the experience. And so you just end up working at McDonald's because you can't actually get into the field. Maybe we shouldn't be berating the kid just for being young. Maybe we should be berating the culture for getting to a point where that kid was the best choice for king. I mean, there were a lot of adults in the land, right? So why did that kid end up being king? What was so messed up in your land that he was the best choice for a ruler? Now, granted, that is reading it a little bit through a modern lens. We have to remember that back then, rulers weren't usually voted in. It was usually just hereditary. So if you have a kid ruling, that probably means that his dad died too young. So it's not his fault that he's a young king. And it's not the land's fault either. And that's where I think we have to take some of this moral element out of woe. Woe to you, O land, when your king is a child. It's not saying that, oh, this is the end of the world and you're a bunch of horrible sinners because you have a kid ruling over you. No, it's basically just saying it's going to take some time to adjust now that the old regime is suddenly out, and we have to deal with this now. We have to prepare this kid to rule when he wasn't going to for another 10, 20, 30 years, what have you. Again, the difference between descriptive and prescriptive. And the part about princes eating in the morning, that's a figure of speech in the Bible for excess or gluttony. Obviously, people did eat breakfast at those times, or at least had something in the morning. But this is saying people who just feast all throughout the day. Basically, someone who is constantly a day drinker, right? So the next verse then says, "Blessed are you, O land, when your king is the son of nobles." That is one possible way to read it, but that doesn't make a lot of sense to me, because that's suggesting a royal family, a royal line, and that's telling me that this person who is now ruling never lived a normal life, right? If they are the son of nobility, if they are a child of nobility, that means they grew up pampered, so they don't actually know what their people need. So I would not at all say blessed is a land when your king is the son of a noble. However, there is another way that you can translate this that I think makes sense. And you could take that word noble, and it can be translated freemen. If we read in that lens of the exile again, we can remember that there were certain Jewish kings still on the throne at certain points of the exile, at least early on. So the verse could actually be saying, "Blessed are you, O land, when your king is the son of free men." In other words, when you don't have another land over you that you are paying tribute to, or when your people are in captivity. That makes sense. And then he compares the princes eating in due season for strength and not for drunkenness. Now, the Net Bible says that you can translate it as for strength and not for drunkenness, or as heroes and not drunkards, or for nourishment and not for drunkenness. The word for strength there can connote self-control. And they say this tactic is adopted by a few English versions, with self-control and not as drunkards, with restraint and not with guzzling. On the other hand, most English versions render it in a woodenly literal sense, for strength and not for drunkenness. However, a few attempt to express the idiom clearly as stalwarts and not as drunkards. Stalwart men or not sots. That is Moffat's old version. I like that one. Stalwart men and not sots. For vigor and not in drinking bouts. That's the NAB. And for refreshment and not for riotousness. Murphy suggests it could mean to gain strength, not just for the pleasure of drinking. Interesting. Verse 18, "By extreme laziness, the roof collapses." That's a literal translation. Now, this foreshadows Qoheleth's use of the metaphor of a decaying house in chapter 12. So we're going to get more into that in a couple weeks here. The word makak that he uses is only used 3 times in the Tanakh, and it's that word for decaying, the house decays. One of the other times it's used in Job. Okay, well, then the word that's used for dropping through, gidloth, is only used one other time in the entirety of the Tanakh, and that's also in Job, Job 16:20, where he says that his eyes, quote, pour out tears to God. That's that word, yidlop, pour out, or in this verse, drop through. I can't help but wonder if Jesus drew on this imagery when he spoke of the house sinking into chaotic sand when flood-like waters descended upon it. It's kind of dense imagery, but that's the way biblical wisdom literature works, and I could possibly see a connection there. Verse 19 literally reads, "Bread brings laughter, and wine brings living joy, but silver responds to everything." Again, the Baptist teachers I had growing up would not like the part about wine brings life joy, but hey, it's right there in your Bible. Silver responds to everything. I read that as kind of being like when you're trying to figure out the best gift to get for someone, and then you finally just settle on money because it's always the right size and the right color. That's kind of what he's saying. I liked what Peterson did in the Message Bible here. Laughter and bread go together, and wine gives sparkle to life. But it's money that makes the world go round. So, sorry, Freddie Mercury, it's actually money that makes the world go round. Just gonna move on. The first 2 lines of this verse make sense. a feast or bread. Food is made for laughter. We eat in community. We have a good time together. We chit chat. We joke. Wine makes merry. Yep, that's easy. I'm kind of curious why the King James left life out of there. Even several other versions left life or living out of there. The idea is basically alcohol brings a little extra joy to life. Which, again, I realize some Christians here might not like, but it's right there in your Bible. But it's the last part that is really kind of hard to understand what the connection is, at least at first. Money answers all things. Is he suggesting we should be okay with bribing people? Is he saying that we should just brute force everything with money, throw cash at it until it works? Is he just saying that this is a true statement, but not actually something that should be this way? It goes back to the descriptive, prescriptive thing. Is he saying this is the way the world should work, or just this is the way the world works? And I lean more into his seeing this as just this is the way the world works. I'm giving you street wisdom so that you understand how to make it in this world. And sometimes you just have to expect to lose to the guy with more money, because money talks, right? You can have the better idea, you can have the better product, but the person with more money is going to be the one who gets the contract, who's going to win the day, right? Not saying that's the way it should be, just saying that's what you should expect in life. Fife, in seeing what Qoheleth saw, suggests the translation, food and wine bring joy, but money preoccupies everything. This would then be contrasting the goodness of enjoying food and wine with the dangers of greed. He says the alternative, however, is not to read this as a carpe diem statement at all, due to the difference in syntax and vocabulary, but rather a proverb collected by Qoheleth, which actually does praise the positive use of money. Now, hang on to your thoughts about this for a second, because I think that this next verse actually helps to interpret verse 19 for us. So, here we go, verse 20. This is the really fun one. Curse not the king, not even in your thoughts, and don't curse the rich in your bedchamber, because a bird of the air will carry the voice, and that which has wings will tell the matter. I remember hearing this growing up as meaning that you can't ever belittle someone, even in private. Don't ever talk bad about someone, no matter how bad they are, no matter how private you think the situation is. Don't ever say a bad thing about someone. Brown kind of takes that road. He says, given the king's unmatched power and range of hearing, it's best not to be in the public or private business of political critique, even if the sage himself, not to mention his predecessors, has occasionally and discreetly attempted it. I think that's pretty emblematic of what you will get in most commentaries. But I don't think that's what Qoheleth is saying. What he's saying is far more pragmatic and way stranger than that. So strap in, because we are about to boldly go where I guarantee no preacher has ever taken this verse before in any way that you have ever heard it preached, all right? This verse would literally read, also, don't underestimate a king in your thoughts or the wealthy in a dark room, because a bird of the skies will carry your voice, and a lord of wings will shout your words. All right, first, let's talk about what it means to curse the king. That's that same word we talked about earlier, kalal, to make little, to belittle someone, or to curse them, and doesn't necessarily mean four-letter words or talking badly about someone. It could actually be talking about an actual curse, like you were trying to put a curse on this person. So that's an important thing here. I think too many people read this and they think, oh, he's saying don't complain about people in authority, even in private. That's not what he's saying. He's not talking about that kind of cursing them. He's saying more so cursing in like a voodoo sort of sense. But where this verse really gets interesting is when he talks about the bird carrying your voice. Now, in English, we have the phrase, a little birdie told me. And this is possibly the origin of that idea. But it's about to get way crazier than you can possibly imagine. First, let's look at one of the Proverbs of Ahikar. And as we've mentioned before, the numbering of those proverbs is all over the place. So I found this as number 15 in certain readings, but it's going to be different in different translations. It reads, above all else, guard your mouth. And as for what you've heard, be discreet. For a word is a bird, and he who releases it is a fool.
Oh, well, everybody's heard about the bird. Bird, bird, bird.
I will do everything in my power not to make a reference to a Family Guy episode here. But who knows what will happen in post. I have very little control over the editing process on this.
Well, everybody's heard about the bird.
And the infamous words of Anakin.
Here's where the fun begins. Hang on!
Because we have scholarly article number 3 here. A bird of the heaven will carry your voice. Ecclesiastes 10:20, The Wisdom of Tiaran by Abraham Ophir Shemesh. Alright, Shemesh surveys a bunch of different scholarly writings on this particular passage and gives us several different possibilities for what the bird of the air referenced here could be. Some believe it is speaking of actual birds that act as God's messengers. That's a little weird and has me thinking that the whole birds or drones theory is not so recent as we might think. It might go back to ancient Israel. But some people have actually taken this literally as meaning carrier pigeons, which is an interesting possibility. Others take it metaphorically as a reference for flying creatures like angels. That's going to come in a little bit more, I think, in the last part of the verse where they talked about winged things, a thing which has wings, or as I gave the translation, a lord of wings. That's a really weird way of putting it. And so pretty much every translation is just going to say some winged creature. But literally it is Baal Haknapayim, a lord of wings. I found a Jewish commentary that went along with this, that Tse'ena Orena Megalot on Ecclesiastes 10:19 says, Do not curse, since the soul of the body carries the voice. The angel who accompanies the person tells everything. The Targum writes that the angel Ratziel calls out every day on Mount Horeb, and his voice goes through the whole world. And this is where it gets really bonkers. The prophet Elijah flies through the air under heaven like an eagle and tells all the secrets that happen in the world. Okay, so that's a little bit of a weird one there, but there are some commentators who have taken this to mean some creature like an angel. All right. Others see it as a metaphor for human spies. Okay. Or, and here's where it gets really funky, but I think it hits the mark. Ornithomancy. And that's a fancy word. Remember earlier in the episode we talked about ophiomancy, using snakes to divine wisdom? Well, ornithomancy is using birds for the same purpose. It was practiced by a lot of ancient societies, Hittites, ancient Egyptians, Greeks, several other cultures. While any number of animals could be used in divination, birds especially were often used. There's even one legend of the establishment of Rome that has Romulus and Remus determining the direction in which to build their city based on the number of eagles that they saw flying that way. Josephus included stories of a Jewish mercenary named Messalamus in Alexander the Great's army 400 years before Jesus, who mocked the Greeks for their use of birds to determine their war strategies. Essentially, they had let loose birds before a battle, and if the birds flew toward the enemy, they'd say, okay, it's time to attack. If they flew the opposite way, we should probably retreat. And there were all sorts of things like that in the ancient Near East where birds would be used to divine what somebody should do with their life or with the next decision that they have to make. As weird as that sounds to us, that is the world that Qoheleth was in. So there are some scholars who think that this isn't talking about angels or, using a metaphor for human spies or anything like that, but actually suggesting that there are people who are skilled enough to read the flight patterns of birds and discern what secrets those birds learn from listening into you. So you think you're safe to say whatever you want because there's no other humans around. Well, you better check, make sure there are no birds listening in either, because someone could potentially read the flight pattern of the bird and figure out what you said. Sounds crazy, I know, but it actually fits within the culture. It is quite possible that that is what Qoheleth had in mind with this verse. The Bible ain't boring, kids. This stuff is fascinating. Now, here's where we get to connect this verse to the previous one. Read in light of the previous verse, I think that this verse is actually saying that money talks, and so will your closest allies if given the right amount of money. Get it? In the previous verse, he said that money answers everything. And then in this verse, he talks about not trying to curse or hex someone else in private because even that can go wrong. Well, maybe it's because anyone that you had in that room with you, even your most trusted allies, can be bought. Everyone has a price. So again, talk less. All right, thanks for sticking with us on this episode. I know it has been a long one and a dense one. Qoheleth, it's just so amazing to me how much he packs into these short verses, right? This was a relatively short chapter. I mean, it had 20 verses, but the verses were short. And yet there is so much incredible wisdom in this that honestly we could have talked for a couple more hours. I had to cut stuff out just to keep it under 2 hours here. But even in all the nerdiness, there was a lot of practical wisdom in this chapter. Avoid extremes. Listen more than you talk. Choose your allegiances carefully, since no regime lasts forever. Every venture brings both risk and reward. Money talks, and so will people if given enough money. Work smarter, not harder. All great advice from this one chapter. Next week, we have the shortest chapter in the book, which I can't make any promises about how long the episode will be, because knowing me, that always ends up running a little bit longer than we had planned anyway, but hopefully shorter than some of the others, since we only have 10 verses next week. And we are going to be covering everything from investment advice to abortion to living life while you're young and quite a bit more. So until next week, stay curious and keep asking questions about the uncut and unfiltered Bible. You've been listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We hope we provided a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. If you enjoyed the podcast, would you take a minute to share it with a friend? You could also rate and review on your podcast app. If you'd like to donate to keep our work going, you can go to our website, thebibleuncut.com, and click on the Support Us tab. While you're there, check out the recommended resources and blog where we post show notes and other articles. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.